Me, I work at Grassroots Al-Quds or Grassroots Jerusalem, which is a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking in Jerusalem. And yes, I met Amir through our global mobilization, which is basically telling the Jerusalem story from a Palestinian perspective to audiences and visitors, whether here in Palestine or abroad. But our main focus is on our communities in Jerusalem. And we believe that we Palestinians in Jerusalem live in a city where it seems like everyone has a decision and a say about our future, the future of our city, the destiny of Jerusalem, except for the Palestinians living in it. So what we do is support Palestinian mobilization and networking in Jerusalem so that our communities can start making our own long-term plans for Jerusalem. We focus on economic development, and what we call emancipatory tourism. We believe that in a city where 40% of the Palestinian economy is based on tourism, while at the same time the Israeli propaganda in tourism hides away the Palestinian presence in the city, there is a need for us Palestinians to raise a louder voice, first of all, showing our existence, showing the reality that we live in Jerusalem, and also support our own communities' economies, because the hiding away the Palestinian presence in the city does suffocate our economy and eventually displace Palestinians from the city, which is the main goal. When it comes to the Israeli occupation plans for Jerusalem, the goal is to displace as many Palestinians as possible, with a declared goal under the title of a so-called demographic balance between Jews and non-Jews in Jerusalem. The Israeli occupation authorities declared in '67 that they wish to limit the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem down to 30% of the population. I will be speaking about Jerusalem mostly today, but I would like to start with saying that Jerusalem is not only a symbol of Palestine for us Palestinians, it's also a very, the story of Jerusalem is reflective of what political reality Palestinians live in Palestine, everywhere in Palestine. And since we are speaking here under the title of apartheid, I find it also necessary to begin with some sort of comment or statement about apartheid. Apartheid is only one tool that the Israeli occupation state uses in Palestine in order to continue controlling the Palestinian population and Palestinian lands. In addition to the military occupation, the military rule over Palestinian communities, the mass incarceration of Palestinians, the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, the divide and conquer strategy is very obvious and clear and has been used against Palestinians since '48. I will be using a presentation, a slideshow presentation about Jerusalem. I will try to keep it as short as possible so that we allow enough time for questions, answers, and a discussion. So I'll start with sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen now? Okay, so let's start with a quick look at the Jerusalem map. This is the map of Jerusalem after the 1967 occupation. What we can see over here on the left is the western part of Jerusalem, ethnically cleansed in 1948, occupied. It's part of the area that was declared as the State of Israel in 1948. No Palestinians live in the western side of Jerusalem. No Palestinian communities live in the western part of Jerusalem. And just to speak a little bit about the lines that we are seeing, you are looking at the green line, the 67 occupation basically line, which is also the internationally recognized border between Palestine and Israel, in our terminology, between 67 occupied lands and 48 occupied lands. The second line I would like to point out here is the Jerusalem municipal boundaries, the way they were redrawn in 1967 after occupying the rest of Jerusalem. The bigger part of Jerusalem that we see here is the historic Jerusalem district with many Palestinian communities, many Palestinian villages scattered in this area. And as you can see, in '67, the Israeli occupation authorities exclude all of these parts of Jerusalem from the newly drawn or redrawn municipal boundaries, basically telling tens of thousands of Palestinians who are historically Jerusalemites, identify as Jerusalemites, who have Jerusalem as their urban center, telling these Palestinians, you are no longer part of Jerusalem. These Palestinians do not have free access to Jerusalem. They cannot enter the city unless they have or acquire a military permit. Palestinians inside the new municipal boundaries in '67 were given, against their will, an Israeli legal status, a legal status that is misleadingly called a permanent residency, which basically treats the indigenous Palestinians of Jerusalem as immigrants to their own city. As such, it's like a residency permit that many countries give, usually to immigrants. In order to keep it, people have to constantly prove that they do actually live within the city of Jerusalem, within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, meaning that they have a physical address, they actually have a house, they rent or own a house within the municipal boundaries, that they pay their taxes, that they receive medical care, that they go to schools and jobs inside the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. A Palestinian who leaves Jerusalem for an extended amount of time, that can be as short as 2 or 3 years, will risk the right to return to their own hometown. According to the Israeli law, leaving Jerusalem for an extended amount of time means that Palestinians lose their right to live in their own city. So the legal status is one of those displacement policies that I was mentioning before, designed in order to limit the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem. Since '67, the Israeli occupation authorities displaced 15,000 Palestinians from Jerusalem, stripped them of their legal status, and with it the permit to live in their own city. Another tool of displacement that is used against the Palestinian population in Jerusalem is also the policing and the army and military control of the population. Look at this photo taken in the old city of Jerusalem. You see the heavy presence of soldiers. These soldiers are called the border police, a unit within the Israeli occupation army that is present heavily and massively all around Jerusalem in the Palestinian communities. And looking at this picture, one might think that there is some sort of emergency, some sort of security emergency. Well, what's happening here in this photo is actually an activity day organized by a girls' school in the old city. Just an example of how Palestinian presence and Palestinian activities, even the non-political ones, are considered a threat. Palestinians are considered a security threat just simply by existing and by being present in their own land, in this case, in their own city, in Jerusalem. Next comes planning, urban planning, of course, a very efficient tool used by colonizers throughout history in order to dictate the reality and in our case to displace Palestinians and to control the Palestinian population in Jerusalem. Palestinian lands are confiscated constantly. Privately owned lands are confiscated for the sake of building and expanding colonies. We are looking here at one such colony in Jerusalem. This is the colony of Ramot. Just outside my window, I live in Shu'afat in Jerusalem. As you can see, cranes are a very present and clear indicator of that expansion of colonies. Wherever you see cranes in Jerusalem, these cranes are usually building more and more housing units in the colonies, in the settlements. You rarely see cranes building any Palestinian homes or expanding any Palestinian communities. So in this case, we also see sorry, in this picture, we also see the roads and the road network that is built all over Jerusalem, connecting Jerusalem to the Israeli colonies all over the West Bank, making it very easy to travel for settlers to travel throughout the West Bank from their colonies to Jerusalem and cross the West Bank from south to north. Needless to say, also these streets and these roads are built on Palestinian lands, usually paving a new road or expanding a road that serves colonies and connects colonies comes at the expense of Palestinian property. So Palestinian land is confiscated and Palestinian homes are demolished in order to build and expand this network of roads. Another purpose for which the Israeli occupation confiscates Palestinian lands is declaring them open scenic areas or green zones, sometimes national and sometimes municipal parks. Looking at this map of Jerusalem, you see not less than 7 such parks, national parks, declared on the lands of Palestinians inside and around Palestinian communities. You know, usually a national park or just a green zone is supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to be a good idea. It's for the well-being of the community. It's for the preservation of nature and protecting environment, while in Jerusalem and in Palestine, everywhere in Palestine, this tool is used in order to dispossess Palestinians and to suffocate Palestinian communities, not allowing them to grow. These lands on which these national parks are declared are usually desperately needed lands for our communities, our neighborhoods and villages to naturally grow and to be able to continue being home to all those Palestinians that live in them and are born in them. By not allowing our communities to grow, by not developing master plans for the Palestinian community in Jerusalem, very systematically, very strategically, master plans are not expanded to fit this natural growth of these communities, suffocating them, keeping them too small to be sufficient to hold all of these Palestinians who eventually find themselves having to go outside of Jerusalem in order to find available or affordable housing. Remember that leaving Jerusalem usually means that their legal status is revocated and they are not allowed to return to Jerusalem. This is just one picture of one Palestinian community. You can compare it to the photo we saw of the colony of Ramot. This is Silwan in the heart of Jerusalem, just south of the old city. As you can see, Silwan and most other Palestinian communities look like a concrete jungle. It is messy, it is poor, it is underdeveloped intentionally. Not only that it is underdeveloped, but also Palestinians who live in these homes risk all the time, constantly, these homes being either demolished or taken by settlers. In Silwan alone, more than 70 Palestinian buildings, residential buildings were confiscated, taken from the Palestinian residents and turned into settler outposts in the heart of Silwan. This is a photo of a home demolition. Another very strategic tool of displacing Palestinians from Jerusalem is not allowing them to build their own homes. So cranes don't build homes for Palestinians, but also when Palestinians want to build their own homes, the Israeli policies, the Israeli laws do not allow it. Again, systematically and strategically, and please remember, always legally under the Israeli law. Just a hint at how the colonial laws are also designed in order to achieve political goals. So in Jerusalem, and again, in many other areas in Palestine, in 48 occupied lands, in Area C, as well as in the eastern part of Jerusalem, Palestinians, of course, need to acquire a building permit in order to build a house. Our orders or when we start submitting applications for building permits, our applications are systematically rejected. The Israeli occupation authorities reject more than 90% of the Palestinian applications for building permits. Rejecting more than 90%, I think it is safe to say that it is a policy, it is a guided policy that strategically prevents Palestinians from striking roots in their own hometown. When Palestinians are rejected, when their applications are rejected, they are left with only two options. They either leave Jerusalem or build illegally, which is usually the choice that families make, knowing that they risk these homes being demolished. After the homes are demolished, as you can see here with the help of corporations using Hyundai in this case in order to displace and dispossess Palestinians, Palestinian families also are forced to cover the expenses of these home demolitions. So the whole process does not only leave families homeless in Jerusalem, but also bankrupt in the awfully expensive city of Jerusalem. Poverty is another tool used to displace Palestinians from the city. Palestinians are left under the official poverty rate. Usually, today we speak about an almost 80% poverty rate among Palestinians in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is one of the most expensive cities in the world, so you can imagine how poverty is another tool of displacement used against the Palestinian presence in Jerusalem. Let's just take one last look at the map of Jerusalem, the way it looks today. As you can see, Palestinian communities, you can see the names of the communities. I hope it's clear enough how they are fragmented. First of all, you can see how lines, border, divide us from each other, isolate us from each other. You can also see how colonies, which are these striped polygons around Jerusalem, how colonies are also further fragmenting Palestinians and preventing Palestinian ties has very severe consequences on the Palestinian communities, especially on their economy. And again, suffocating the economy is another very efficient tool of displacing Palestinians from Jerusalem. I will stop here, even though I can go on really for hours about Jerusalem. I will leave time for one last comment before we open for discussion. And I will also insert in our chat some useful links for people who would like to read more about Jerusalem and about our work in Jerusalem. So Grassroots Al-Quds works within this context. And as I was saying before, our goals are to network, so to overcome the fragmentation, to economically develop our communities, which we think and believe gives them both a higher voice to politically tell their story and mobilize for their struggle, but also helps us to be self-sufficient, self-sustainable, which is necessary for us to remain steadfast and resilient in Jerusalem and keep our roots. Now, the next and final question I would like to answer in my intervention is, what can you do? What can people around Palestine do to help the Palestinian struggle for liberation? And, you know, for years, for decades, Palestinians have been saying this is apartheid, this is a destructive regime that is disempowering and fragmenting our Palestinian people, disempowerment which leaves people unable to resist dispossession and displacement. But it's become a voice. I think the Palestinian voice has become a voice that many people around the world are tired of hearing. They are tired of thinking about this, what seems like a complex case that is very hard to resolve. And it is needless to say also how sensitive the topic is in Germany, since we are speaking here about German politics and German people. So it is frustrating, I have to say, that when an Israeli human rights organization finally dares call things by their name and say, and B'Tselem comes out and says this is apartheid, suddenly it is news. Suddenly it is worthwhile, it is worthy listening to. So I would like also to address that as well. but then again, I am happy that this opportunity came up, and that's fine. And again, we have the chance to talk about what people can do. And you know, people can do so much to support the Palestinians here. I will quickly say, by changing policy regarding Palestine and Israel, by telling your own decision makers that they cannot diplomatically support the Israeli regime, selling nuclear submarines, for example, telling the German government does not help protect Palestinian human rights, does not help protect Palestinians from Israel. On the contrary, so Israel is made stronger by having these diplomatic ties and this diplomatic support. It's again, we can speak about international law and how international law keeps disappointing Palestinians and keeps failing to protect Palestinian rights, regardless of how many United Nations resolutions there are against Israel and its enterprise in Palestine. So we at Grassroots Al-Quds believe in grassroots mobilization. We believe that building ties with grassroots organizations and movements around the world will help, first of all, mobilize solidarity for Palestine, true solidarity, and also connecting struggles is important, because in these times that we live, the story in Palestine is not just the story of the Zionist occupation of Palestine. It is the global economic colonization of Palestine. So many corporations are invested in this Zionist project in Palestine. So many corporations are invested in killing the Palestinian people and disempowering the Palestinian people and displacing Palestinians from Jerusalem. And I think, again, that it is the people's right and duty and responsibility to go and say, not with our money, not with our taxpayer money, and not with our customer money. We will not support companies and corporations that are boldly and shamelessly invested in such a project. And the last thing to say is also, we've witnessed in the last few years how the Israeli propaganda and the Israeli Zionist and the Zionist lobby has been not only violating Palestinian rights, but also leading to the violation of other people's rights. I think that if you couldn't care less about Palestine, you should at least care about your own freedom of expression. And I am talking about anti-BDS legislation. That is not only the case in Germany, but in many other countries as well. And I think that this is dangerous, not just for the Palestinian struggle, but also for you too. So protect your rights, help protect Palestinian rights by not being complicit with it. I'm sorry if I spoke too long, but I will open it now for discussions. I hope it was provocative enough.
Thank you, Fayrouz. I think that was a very clear and strong message throughout, but also at the end, it's about human rights for Palestinians, but it's of course also about human rights for all of us. So I'm going to open up the floor to everybody to ask. If you want to ask a question to Fayrouz, unmute yourself or write the question in the chat, and then I'm sure Fayrouz is happy to reply. Okay. I see you.
I think Judith wanted to ask a question. Not quite sure.
Yes, thank you very much, Fayrouz. I just wanted to tell you that I used to hold similar lectures here in Germany, especially in Munich. And because of such a lecture, I'm forbidden to speak at all. This is the situation in Germany. And behind it, I must say, unfortunately, is a Jewish community. They fight us wherever they can. They fought against Rainer, he's dead now. So now they fight me and the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue and everybody. And unfortunately, our politicians don't do anything.
Well, I think that Palestine is always a good opportunity also to check your own political reality everywhere. I think that looking at the foreign policy of a certain country or the involvement of a certain country's corporations again in the occupation of Palestine is also an indicator of the human rights situation in that country as well. You know, we're not the only ones, the Palestinians, who do not have their full rights enjoyed. And I think that it is time also, especially for the global north and for the white people, to realize that they are not as free as they imagine they are, that they that the need or their way to support Palestine is not only by coming here and volunteering or by funding or by providing humanitarian aid. I think that people really need to hold the mirror and look at their own reality. And again, people being prevented to speak, people being stripped of titles or prizes or jobs is the reality that so many people are living around the world in relation to their standpoints on Palestine. And again, if the internal motive that mobilizes people of caring for justice is not strong enough, then at least people should be worried about their own liberty and freedom, which they are losing gradually with the help of the Israeli and Zionist lobby and money.
Thanks for that. I think there's a question in the chat to you, Fayrouz. What do you say about Palestinians in Jerusalem participating in municipal elections?
That's a great question, and my answer relates also to the participation of Palestinians in 48 occupied lands in the Israeli parliamentarian elections. You know, just to make it clear to everyone, I am not an original Jerusalemite. I was born in near al-Faham, near Nazareth, in 48 occupied lands. So I do hold the Israeli citizenship. But again, of course, I identify as Palestinian. I never identify as an Israeli. And I support the boycott of elections, whether of Palestinians in 48 lands. I support the boycott of the Knesset elections, as well as the boycott of Palestinians in Jerusalem of the municipal elections. And you know, this is a very recurring question, or the context behind the question is, don't you think if you have representation, then you will have better conditions, then you will have more budgets coming into your communities and more schools and hospitals and homes built for your own people? And the very straightforward, simple answer is no, I don't think. I actually think that it doesn't. I know it doesn't. Palestinians in 48 occupied lands have had representatives at the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, since the beginning. Everything I told you about Jerusalem today is true for my own hometown inside so-called Israel. So the illusion that Palestinians who live in 48 occupied lands are living a different reality than the ones living in 60, 67 occupied lands, where the military rule is actually clear and straightforward, is an illusion we need to tarnish. In Jerusalem, 98% of the Palestinians boycott the municipal elections. They boycott the municipal elections because they consider the Israeli municipality an occupation municipality. It is illegitimate and it is illegal. And there is always the question when it comes to oppressed people, the choice we have to make all the time between ideology and practice, between our principles and our needs. And I think it's also time to realize that this is an unfair choice that people have to make. And Palestinians in Jerusalem, as well as in other areas around Palestine, many of them make the ideological choice. And for example, speaking about people who lose their lands that are confiscated for the sake, say, of national parks. According to the Israeli law, the Israeli occupation authorities must compensate the owners of the private land that was confiscated for a national park. But most Palestinian owners of these lands don't accept the compensation because they don't want to cooperate with the system, because they don't want to cooperate and legitimize the confiscation of the land. And I think that people need to be supported in their ideological choices. It's not on the Palestinian people to care more about their daily needs, but rather what we believe should be done is for us to be able, through mutual aid and community organizing, be able to help each other, sustain each other, and solidarity with each other is important so that people can continue making those right ideological choices and decisions.
Great answer. I think it shows really well, you know, that Palestinians follow ideology and not necessarily some voting rights, right? I mean, it is at the end of the day about the situation and the human rights situation of Palestinians altogether. So we are a bit over time, but there's one more question of Christoph and one question in the chat, which may make sense to ask you now because it kind of follows on to the previous one. By definition, basic law, Knesset Article 7a denies any and all possibility for a member of Knesset to work towards democratizing the Zionist race state. So what value can there be in voting to such people who agreed to this condition in the first place?
Well, hi, Ronnie. A good question. Rhetorical a bit, no? Well, I think it's a good reminder, Ronnie's question, to also, again, speak about Israeli laws. And, you know, Israel shows off being the only democracy in the Middle East. And I think that people usually accept that without questioning it, without testing it. And by looking at the Israeli laws, and here is just one example, ironically enough, the law about the parliament itself is saying we are not a democracy and Israel is not a democracy. And I think that what's important here to say is that there is a triangle of three actors that are working hand in hand when it comes to Jerusalem or Palestine in general. There is the legislator, there is the Knesset, the parliament that makes and legislates racist laws that want to ensure Jewish supremacy in Palestine. And then there is the court system which implements these laws that signs the eviction orders, the confiscation orders that we Palestinians are expected to go to as a refuge to protect our rights. You know, Palestinians are expected to go to Israeli courts in order to stop their family evictions, just like those families in Sheikh Jarrah today, their land confiscation, the revocation of our legal status. But again, isn't this a waste of our time and energy and money? Because by default, the colonial court system is going to support the colonial goals, political goals in Palestine. And then the third actor is those very well-oiled settler organizations that come with a lot of money, that have the chance to take us Palestinians to tiring, history-long court cases where Palestinians are losing breath and power and money and being exhausted, losing court cases, and then our lands are given to these settlers on which they build settlements and colonial projects all over our land. So that's what I find very important to emphasize here. Again, the illusion that there is an actual democratic regime here is very problematic. I know it makes it very easy for people because then we have a reference. Yeah, there is law and order and there is the rule of law. Well, law itself is unjust, law itself is unlawful, law itself is oppressive when it comes to the political reality that Palestinians live.
Thanks for that, Fayrouz. I would say last question. As I can't see any in the chat, I would give the word to Christoph. There's one last question to you.
Yeah, to be honest, it's rather 46 questions, but I will try to restrict myself. Shukran Katir, Fayrouz, for enlightening us about the situation. I think it was a wonderful choice that Amir brought us up in it. Who could we ask, if not you, to tell us about the situation, really. Thank you very much. I think one of the most positive developments that we had inside of Germany in the recent years was that Palestine Speaks forums. So I think that's very encouraging to see that especially young German Palestinians, however they identify, do speak up for themselves. We don't need you to speak for us and stuff, but empower themselves. So and also I guess that in this chat, where most people are far as I can guess, most people are from the majority of Germans. People are here because they share a great deal of what you are saying or what we are bringing forward. So we're kind of preaching to the choir here. So my question would ask you to address hypothetically or theoretically to people who are not here and are not necessarily the majority of Germans or so, but here's the question. So I'm focusing here on two groups. On one is politicians and mayors and members of the Bundestag, of the parliament. If you had the chance to speak to one of them who's actually actively enabling anti-BDS, anti-Palestinian racist legislation, who are hindering us from giving this talk now inside the municipal building, who are actively fighting and smearing Palestine activists. My first question is, what would you tell those people if you had the chance to speak to them directly? And the second one, somehow connected to this, there are voices inside the German Palestinian Society. I don't mean the organization, I mean Palestinians living in Germany, who are arguing, well, it's not very wise to do this BDS thing. It's, you know, it causes too much trouble. People are getting upset. So let's keep our voices a little lower and make it easier for poor white Kartoffel Germans understanding the situation. So what would you tell those Palestinians? And what would you tell German lawmakers who are involved in protecting Israeli crimes, basically? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, we at Grassroots Al-Quds believe that is your job to talk your own decision makers. We stopped wasting donor money that we hardly managed to get and our energy and blood, sweat and tears on advocating towards German policymakers or any other policymakers. I can tell you it was devastating for me to do a Bundestag advocacy tour once in the past because you sit there and talk to them, the person is nice, the person has brains, the person knows you are right, you speak in reference to international law and human rights declaration and international conventions, and they cannot argue with that. But then the bottom line was always, don't expect us to be the ones who raise the voice against Israel, this is a sensitive matter, and so on and so forth. We think that it is your job, and what your job to tell them is that it's a clear-cut case of justice and injustice. This is a clear-cut case of war crimes. This is a clear-cut case of what needs to be stopped if you truly believe in your own responsibility towards other peoples around the world. I think that it is devastating, and I will connect it again with the, I'll connect it with the second group you are talking about, which is certainly our target audience when it comes to advocacy, Palestinians and Palestine solidarity movements, not only Palestinians in the diaspora. I think that it is frustrating to us all to see how we always need to soften our tone. We always need to soften our message because there are stubborn people who refuse to see facts on the ground. You know, I was speaking to one of our partners in a different European country, and they were saying, we are campaigning against the Jerusalem Light Rail, but the companies that we are talking to are saying if there aren't any legal cases against it, then there is no evidence that this project is breaking international law. Well, let me give you some news. First of all, international law and the ceiling of international law is way lower than the Palestinian general ceiling of our demands and what we wish for. So we are already compromising by saying, let's uphold international law. And then even by trying to use international law as a reference, it is a hard job to do. I think it is safe to say that I do speak for many Palestinians when I say that we don't believe in international law as a tool that will help us protect our rights. That's exactly why we believe in grassroots mobilization. We believe in the power of money that is used exactly for violating our rights. We believe that people have the right, but whether it is their political right or their individual right as customers to apply this pressure that I think that decision makers are not making based on my advocacy. I think that the true way to go about it is us speaking to you as people who are voters of these decision makers, and you should go and say, not with our taxpayer money, not with our votes. You will not remain in that seat if you continue supporting war crimes. I really don't think that we need to continue showing statistics, producing reports, saying the same thing over and over again to prove that there are human rights violations in Palestine. This is ridiculous. And I think that we need to grow a stronger spine, all of us, Palestinians, Palestine solidarity, justice movements around the world. We should raise a louder voice and say, no, it's not our responsibility and duty to prove the obvious. There need not be a report about every single atrocity that Israel is committing in Palestine to convince people that they need to mobilize against it. I think that by refusing and dictating how our advocacy sounds like, how we support each other in our advocacy, we are able to achieve much better results.
Great answer. I think this speaks to all of us. It's about us here, right? About us in this call, about all Palestinians in Germany. We have to drive this change. I think there's only so much that you can do, Fayrouz, and all Palestinians in Palestine, right? There's enough that has to be borne on your back. So I think that's a very, very good message to all of us. Thank you so much. Fayrouz, we're a bit over time, but a big round of applause to you. Really, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to talk about this, to talk about the situation of you and all the Palestinians in Jerusalem, but also elsewhere.
Thank you for having me, and keep up the good work, and let us know how we can continue supporting you.
Absolutely, we will keep you updated. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye bye.